Hello, and welcome to a mini episode of the Ostrich Technique podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Ananth.
And I'm your other host, Chris.
Yeah, so Chris, today, I've discussed this, but for our listeners, this is going to be a little bit of a different episode, kind of in the vein of our Across the Spider-Verse episode and Guardians of the Galaxy 3 episode. We did recently see The Marvels. The Marvels was in theaters, and we wanted to talk about that just briefly. I mean, I don't think you and I had a ton of thoughts on it overall, Chris, which is why actually this one's going to be a slightly different mini episode than usual, where we're actually going to talk a little bit more about the state of Marvel overall, and I think how the Marvels really encapsulates some of the thoughts that we have about the overall state of Marvel. Yeah, Chris, I mean, do you have any other thoughts on this mini episode before we jump right into it?
Oh, let's jump right into it.
Yeah, so of course, The Marvels was directed by Nia DaCosta and stars Brie Larson, Iman Vellani, Teyonah Parris, and Samuel L. Jackson. And this is the third MCU movie this year. And I mean, coming into this movie, I don't think there was a ton of hype across the general fan base. I mean, no, I wasn't particularly hyped for this, Chris. I don't know about you. I,
Nope,
I I assume it was the same, right?
no hype at all.
No hype at all. And I mean, it definitely seems to have been showing in the box office, which has not been particularly positive, which is kind of a shame. I mean, especially considering 4 years ago with Endgame, one of the highest grossing, if not the highest grossing movie of all time for a little bit, and now it's this movie's actually going to make a loss. It might be the first MCU movie ever to make a loss, right, Chris?
Y- I mean, I haven't checked the numbers, but yeah, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, Chris, why don't you briefly give your thoughts on this one? I know we didn't want to spend too much time on this because we did want to spend more time talking about the MCU postmortem.
Yeah, I don't know. I wasn't really a big fan,
Hmm.
but I thought it was fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. It wasn't really anything special in my opinion. You know,
Hmm.
the post credit was big, but that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are just some quick thoughts.
Yeah. I mean, I think I overall share your sentiments there. Like, it wasn't like a mind-blowing movie here. I mean, definitely Guardians 3 was the highlight of the
Hmm.
MCU this year. Movie-wise, of course, there was also Loki in terms of TV, which was quite good. But this movie was, I think there were definite elements of fun to it, which I think honestly the bar being lowered in terms of reviews, I didn't expect too much from the story going in. I mean, it had like a 60 something on Rotten Tomatoes, and I think it's still hovering around there. I think that's where it ended up landing. But it was fun for what it was. I enjoyed the chemistry, I think, between the three main leads, between Bree, Iman, and Tayona. No, you and I discussed this once we came out of the movie and we saw it together, was that Iman Vellani for me was definitely the highlight of it. And I
Hmm.
think this sort of infectious and joyful energy that she brought to it definitely made things more interesting. And
Yep.
there was definitely there were hints of like complexity to this stuff that she was having to deal with because of course she was dealing with pretty small stakes in the Miss Marvel show overall, and seeing the much more planetary stakes on that were threatening people like the Skrulls, like that whole sequence where they had to save the Skrulls and she had to sort of come to terms with you can't really save everyone, and then the character progression of her having to make the tough choice on Aladna and taking Bree out of it was, it was interesting to see that, but it all happened a bit too quick for me. I feel like we didn't get enough time to sort of soak with these characters. And I think one of the key points that really stuck out to me was the sequence where they were doing the sort of memory going back
Yep.
bit, and you get bits of this complexity where you see Teyona Paris with rather Monica Rambeau with her mom Maria Rambeau, and how she wanted Captain Marvel to be there, and Captain Marvel actually did come to visit, but she never came to give Monica her support. And there was something interesting there, but the movie doesn't really spend time on it, and it really just sort of like, oh, I'm really sorry, I should have been there for you and I wasn't, and they really sort of just move on from it a bit too quickly and don't give time to really marinate with these characters, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. A lot of these character moments are not really there, or like
Yeah.
at least the ones that, like you said, have these interesting dynamics or relationships they don't really spend too much time on. I mean, obviously, Kamala's family, they still have that dynamic coming from the Miss Marvel
Yes.
show, which, I was not the biggest fan of the show, but
Hmm.
thought that that translated very well to the movie itself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree. Otherwise, like there was an interesting dynamic between Carol and Monica that they kind of just was like you said, hey, I wasn't there. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I'm here now. Like, can we reconcile?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, beyond that, the villain was also pretty
Ve-
forgettable
Yeah, I
overall.
was
Like, I
gonna say
think they
very
could have.
forgettable.
I mean, we could have talked. There was definitely like a nugget of something interesting there, like Darben trying to save her people, but never really materialized into anything more, which was kind of a shame. Just because, I'm sure that Zoe Ashton's a great actress and could have given a lot more. And the score also, nothing to write home about, I think. Pretty generic score overall. But yeah, I mean, I guess any final thoughts here, Chris? And I guess we can just jump because I think, coming out of this movie, we really felt that this sort of encapsulates a lot of the sort of problems that the MCU's been having overall.
Hmm.
But I guess before we jump into that, was there any final bits you wanted to talk here about the Marvels?
The only final bit is that uh, I feel like it's just getting very sort of repetitive or even lazy that they
Mm,
have the whole villain of, oh, like I'm going to do something that puts the entire world or like galaxy, at risk. And it's like,
yeah.
I don't know, this just keeps happening where it's like, can we maybe have villains or some sort of danger that's not like this level of a threat? Where, we have the Marvels with this, where like, oh, we have another multiverse sort of thing. Same thing with like
Hmm.
Quantumania, same thing with like Love and Thunder. It's just
Yeah.
a lot of, hey, there's these wide threats, we might lose everything. Where it's like, let's maybe make it a smaller, smaller level of threat here.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I agree with that. Like, I mean, maybe like Ant-Man, for example, with the first movie where it was very much like a personal thing between his family against Yellow Jacket.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it's a very valid point. Like, definitely, scaling the stakes rather than it just having be a sort of a universe or world-ending threat every time.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think all very well taken points there, Chris. And yeah, I guess jumping back to what I was mentioning just right before was I think Chris, you and I agreed that this movie really highlighted, I think, a bunch of problems with the MCU formula or like the MCU sort of approach overall recently at least. And I think that you and I sort of hit on, some of these points in just our discussion here. And the way that we've sort of decided to structure this is that you and I have each come up with three different things that we feel that Marvel has sort of been struggling with. And, I'll start right away. Mentioned this right before was this movie really sort of glossed over a lot of the character moments. And I think, especially us starting this podcast and going through phase one when we did, has been kind of interesting just to sort of see the Marvel approach in those first few movies. I mean, obviously, we haven't seen the Avengers yet, but the first five movies or so, and now seeing how Marvel's approaching their characters now. For me, the shift away from focusing on characters and instead focusing on the overarching story has really been a big problem for me. One of the reasons that all of us really got invested in all of these characters was because they were focused on the characters and there wasn't really as much there were little nuggets here and there, of course, overall that things were leading to the Avengers, but that was not really the primary sort of narrative or the directive that they were going. Obviously that was sort of underlying there, and people that were looking for that stuff and knew to look for that stuff knew, oh, okay, they are leading towards the Avengers, but the focus was always primarily on the characters, which is why come to Endgame we were so invested in, say, Tony and Steve and Thor and Loki and all of the different characters, because there was such a focus on those characters. And, even before phase 4 and 5, the movies in the MCU which were more focused on the overarching story and really trying to pull that connective tissue in, like think of Iron Man 2, for example, or Avengers Age of Ultron, which really had we're really trying to force, like, oh man, we're really leading to something bigger. There's like something big coming here. I think that those were always the weaker movies within the MCU for sure. And I think that that's one of the biggest complaints for me overall with the new MCU. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, Chris.
Yeah, well, actually, one of my points kind of builds off of, or is tangentially related to that with the characters.
Hmm.
In that, yeah, there's been a shift to newer characters, which is understandable. Like, obviously, in reality, the actors, feel like they need to move on or the contracts, are up, and the MCU needs to just shift to newer characters and have newer faces of these franchises or of the MCU in general. I think that's been a big miss. Um, we've heard of the transition of the big three of Iron Man, Cap, and Thor to what was supposed to be like Spider-Man, was it Doctor Strange, or like Black Panther and Captain Marvel, some combination of those three.
Yeah,
Um, I really do think they really fumbled that. I feel like a lot of it is we haven't really had some sort of investment in these characters like we did with the big three or like just the original six.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, definitely.
Particularly, characters like Captain Marvel, where there's just been it's been very divisive.
Yeah,
Um, I think that's been a huge issue is this transition and then them moving forward with this roster of characters which people or fans may not be fully invested in as they were with the original six Avengers or so.
yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And not being invested in them, I think a large part of it is the point that I was just making is that they've not really taken the time to invest in these characters. Like we don't really get those sort of slower moments that I mean, we've been talking a lot about this with some of the Phase 1 movies so far, that the moments that like with Tony and Pepper, for example, like those aren't necessarily moments that are pushing the story forward, but just the human interaction between the two of them was really sort of the heart and soul of the movie. Even like Peggy and Steve, like when they're sitting in that bar from Captain America after Bucky is dead, doesn't really progress the story forward, but like that just sort of that moment to breathe and to get a sense of, oh man, this is how Steve really feels. And I can connect with him in this moment because I understand what it's like to lose someone, or I can understand that sort of emotion that he's going through. Like you don't get those sorts of moments anymore. Like, I mean, look at again the Marvels where Monica Rambeau and Captain Marvel are sort of, I guess in the earlier MCU they would maybe give that movie a second to breathe and just sort of for them to sit in it and maybe reflect on what's happening to them and why that's happening to them. And we just don't get that anymore.
Mm,
But yeah, I think both of our points there really sort of connect well there.
yeah.
Yeah, any other points that you'd like to add there? And we can sort of move into the second point that we have, or that I have at least, or
Well, my second point also kind of connects to something you said earlier about connective tissue. I feel that there's been just a lack of apparent connective tissue between
yeah,
projects. I do think, they do layer it in, so it's still there, but it's not very apparent, especially to the casual viewer. Very organically in like the earlier phases, certain characters or certain references pop up in different movies
mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
refer to other franchises. Whereas
Right.
now it's very much separate for like at least it's not very it's very very subtle, like too subtle. Or I don't know. Like for instance, having Valkyrie pop up in Captain Marvel, like I feel like it really could have been anybody. Whereas, they're just trying to plug in these people just to make the viewer aware like, oh hey, we're still, part of this larger universe. It
Right.
doesn't really feel as organic. Uh, and I think this will lead to your point where it's that lack of connective tissue is definitely, not, it's definitely lacking that connective tissue. And the only real connective tissue I feel is if you have to watch like certain shows or whatnot, where you just have to do a ton of watching of other material for you to feel like, okay, this stuff kind of all meshes together. And sometimes that can just be like overload.
Right. Yeah, not really good point. The idea that there's not really been sort of connective tissue between these projects. It's interesting because they're really trying to push the idea that, oh man, it's really all connected, and I think the organic nature of it definitely has not been there. I totally agree with your point there. And I think part of what that does is, without creating those sort of explicit connections or connections that make sense or feel like they make sense, makes it feel like you have to watch everything, which wasn't really an issue beforehand with, the
Hmm.
MCU, where you could feel like you could watch maybe one thing here or there. Like, I mean, think of, my sister, for example. Like, my sister hasn't necessarily seen she, I think, enjoys the MCU. She enjoys parts of it, but she's definitely not seen every movie like you or I have, for example, or like every TV show. But she could go into an Avengers movie and still understand what was going on, or she could go into like a Black Panther randomly, or like any point was a valid entry point for an MCU watcher or like a very casual watcher of the MCU, and they didn't really feel like they were missing out on things per se. I mean, sure, they might miss out on some of the nuance here and there, like, or there might be a reference to something from another movie they might not fully understand, but it never took away from the story. Versus, I think here, there are things that, like, they try and make it seem as though, oh, you're like not in the know if you don't know what X, Y, and Z is, but at the same time, it doesn't really connect with some of the other stories that they've really been telling. And I mean, guess you mentioned my sort of second point there a little bit, was that and I think that really also leads into what was happening in the Marvels, was that there was, I think, a little bit too much homework for the casual viewer here.
Yeah, you have to
And
watch two shows to and a movie to know who these characters were.
yeah, exactly. I think that they did some to some level, like, kind of got who Miss Marvel was and like her family relationship was, but I think definitely like people were coming in saying, "Who is this Miss Marvel character? Who is Teyonah Parris? Who is Monica Rambeau?" Like, no one knew who they really were unless you saw WandaVision or Miss Marvel. And I mean, to be fair, you can watch, I mean, a lot of original movies, and especially some of the newer MCU movies introduce characters that had not been in any prior property, and the movie takes time to explain it. But the idea of this movie, at least in my how I saw the movie and how I perceived it, was it didn't seem like they really spent as much time to, sort of flesh out these characters as much. Like, they sort of really jump right into them. You get, I think, really the bare bones to understand them, but definitely you wouldn't be as invested in them if you hadn't seen their shows.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
not to like just not like just like sort of a top level of sort of understanding. This is, I think, a much like a deeper understanding of those characters you really were missing out on if you did not watch those shows. Not like just some sort of like Easter egg from another show that you could have skipped or not seen. So I think the idea that there's just too much homework, while simultaneously just some of the stuff does not feel essential. Like, at the same
Yeah.
time, want to have watched Miss Marvel to understand Kamala's character and her family's story and all of that, the connection that they have and why she feels so close to them. At the same time, her show, quite frankly, does not feel like it connects with the rest of the MCU, which is not a bad thing, but they've been touting the MCU that, oh, everything's connected. This is all critical to understand what's going on here. And really, the only connective tissue is that she's important because she's going to show up in the Marvels, as opposed to Marvel trying to make it seem that, oh, she's important because she's connecting with this overall grand story of the multiverse saga. And for you and I, because we watch all this stuff, we understand the sort of connective tissue, and we can sort of look back on it and say, okay, maybe this wasn't as important versus something else. But for the casual viewer, like, yes, I'm using my sister again as a proxy, there's no way that she would know that, okay, this is not important for me to watch, or this is really important for me to watch, other than me telling her that, because
Hmm.
obviously I'm much more in this mythology and the sort of the lore of all of it than she is.
Yep, that's all fair points.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have anything else to add to that, Chris?
No, I think our points so far have kind of gone hand in hand with each other.
Yeah.
And I think your final point also kind of we've alluded to, and I think also lent itself well to this conversation. I don't know
Mhm.
if you'd like to bring that up now.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sort of jumping the lead there, but for me, I think it's not really as connected to all of these points here. I think part of it kind of is, but there's been a lot of MCU projects that have come out since phase 3 ended. I mean, thinking back to, I mean, from 2019 to 2023, I can't even count how many projects there's
Too
been.
many.
I think like, yeah, too many. That's the number. There's been too many projects. And I think that's really that's the last point that I have here, that there's really just been too much and it's been way too fast. And that also has added to the point that like viewers just can't keep up with all of this stuff. And frankly, viewers don't want to keep up with all of the level of stuff here just because there's just been not everything has been important to watch. It doesn't feel like everything is leading up to something important. And it kind of leads to your point, Chris, also that the MCU has suffered for it. Like the MCU has
Yeah.
suffered for it in terms of viewership and engagement, and suffered in terms of the quality of the output that's been coming out from
Hmm.
these projects overall. I think it's safe to say that people, I mean, whether obviously people can enjoy these movies to varying degrees, but I think people would agree that the quality of the movies has definitely not been to the level that it was before Endgame and Infinity
Yeah.
War for sure.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and all these reports about the different visual effects artists, coming
Hmm.
out and saying how toxic of an environment it is and how they're being grinded with last minute changes and how Marvel is
Yeah.
heavily relying on visual effects and CGI rather than the practical effects that they had in the earlier phases, which has led to my point of there's just been so much CGI and Marvel's become too reliant on it. And because there's just such a push for, hey, we want to be flexible, let's just film this on a green screen. And then when we figure out in the editing room how we want to chop this up, then we'll do last minute changes. When you have just that scaled on a huge magnitude of several projects coming out all within the span of like a year or whatever,
Hmm.
the quality suffers so much, and the CGI is just not up to par. Especially when you look at the early like Iron Man, for instance. Like, yeah, there were some practical effects, but there were definitely some CGI with that suit, and it still looked flawless.
Yeah,
And you
absolutely.
and now you look at something like Quantum Mania, where the CGI is just horrendous,
Yeah.
horrendous. Uh,
Oh.
and like even like the Black Panther movies, like especially like the third act of the first Black Panther,
Hmm.
that final fight with Killmonger and Black Panther, just and the CGI rhinos. It's the CGI has just been such low quality for what we've seen previous movies, and it is just a bit ironic given how the technology has been getting better like over the years, and yet Marvel's output of this product has just decreased over the years, and it's a function of,
Yeah.
like you said, just too much, way too fast, which is causing these visual effects artists to really, really just rush and not put out the best quality, and they know it, and
Yeah.
they're kind of in a between a rock and hard place in this situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit on that point really well. It's definitely not the visual effects artist's fault. It's like, I mean, we know that these visual effects artists are capable of just some extraordinary visual effects from movies when they have the time and they have the bandwidth to be able to, create incredible visual effects. Like honestly, even Endgame, for example. Like I know
Yeah,
Endgame, they were working on that movie for over 2 years, 3 years, and even Infinity War, and it shows. Like the visual effects on it are honestly very good. The effects on Thanos in particular
Thanos.
are
Yeah,
some of the best visual effects on a fully CG generated character ever. And really does show that they've done a lot of good work in when they're given the time and can put in the effort into that versus Quantum Mania, which you can tell was rushed, and there's been reports on the fact that it was very rushed project and they just weren't able to finish the CG that was in that movie. And yeah, I mean the CG has just been very disappointing, and I think we've really been sort of giving our sort of thoughts on the things that have been wrong with the MCU. I didn't want to I don't want to end on this episode being such a dour note overall, because I do think that there are signs that the MCU recognizes these issues and it's not just sort of sticking its head in the sand like an ostrich, but they do want to make things better. I think that they've definitely been making productive steps, at least from what we've been reading in the news and the trades about this. So, like, in terms of too much homework and not everything feeling essential. I'm not saying everything has to feel essential for sure. I think that part of it is that don't sell the audience that everything is essential when it really isn't. Like, thinking of when they like early phase 4 when we were getting like, oh, this is going to be the multiverse saga, and I remember that whole thing of, oh yeah, this the first 3 multiverse saga is really going to be it's going to be WandaVision, and I think Doctor Strange, and there was like one other in
Key
like
probably.
Spider-Man No Way Home. No, it was Spider-Man No Way Home. That was the
Okay.
3. It was like, oh, they're gonna have like this sort of like connective tissue between all 3 of them, because like Wanda's connected to Doctor Strange and Doctor Strange is connected to Spider-Man, and this is going to be like a big thing to like set up the multiverse saga. And they really weren't all that connected. I mean, they were good properties to varying degrees in their own right, but they really didn't connect with one
No.
another, you know? But I mean, part of that is that again, they were sold as all being connected and being all relevant to the overarching story. And I think Marvel is fixing that now a little bit with the idea of the Marvel Spotlight brand, which they've just introduced with the trailer for Echo, which I think we briefly talked about this, Chris, separately, right? Where this is going to be more street level stories, which don't
Hmm.
necessarily connect to the broader MCU, but it is still within the MCU,
Yeah.
which I'm perfectly happy with that. Like, make smaller level. That speaks to your point also of like not having like massive like universe ending or world ending or galaxy ending stakes. Like, this can be like just a small level, street level story, and that's
Yep.
what apparently Spotlight's going to do, which I'm all for. Like, let's see more of those.
Yeah. And they recognize the fatigue, and moving forward, they're committed to putting out less projects per year.
Yeah.
Like next
Hmm.
year, it's going to only be Deadpool 3 in terms of films,
Yep.
which I think will help as well, allowing viewers to kind of digest the material a little bit more, get a little breathing room, and also
Hmm.
for the workers themselves, like we mentioned, like give them more time to focus on certain properties or certain projects. Put
Yeah.
in greater effort so it comes out as better product.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think having, the time, not even just to work on all of the visual effects that they have, because I mean, back in 2025, they're going to have a full slate again, but also I think giving time for Marvel as like the production side of it internally to just sort of refocus and recalibrate and think about the best way to sort of move forward. And whether that means a little bit more time focusing on the scripts, or whether that means more time to work on the CGI, or both, honestly, I think that hopefully the extra time should help with that.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think now also I know we were talking about the too much too fast thing. Another thing that I know we saw was the whole report that came out from, I forget who it was, whether it was Variety or the Hollywood Reporter, about their focus on TV being more like movies. And that was sort of to
Hmm.
expedite the production cycle, just because they're familiar with how to make movies, and they were trying to, upend the way that they made TVs. And obviously a lot of their TV shows did not work, unfortunately, in terms of resonance with the audience. And that even on that front, they're shifting the approach and making it more like a traditional TV format, where they're going to have a proper showrunner who's going to oversee the entire, production of the television show and writing of the show, and make sure that it's consistent. Because that, I think, speaks to your point, Chris, where the writing of the shows haven't been as consistent as they could have been, and the characters haven't been developed as much overall. And hopefully having a showrunner can also, blend back into the TV shows, where you have like one person's like with the Bible of like, this is the character, this is how I envision them, and that can sort of connect back into the movies.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, I think there's definite reasons to be hopeful that the MCU can, sort of course correct. Obviously, it needs to earn back the trust and respect of the fans, but I think, hopefully, let's see how Deadpool 3 shakes out, but hopefully they can, course correct and get back on track, and we can get back to, really praising these movies like we have been, at least with some of these early ones so far.
Hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully, yeah. But any final points here, Chris, before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered some good ground
Yeah,
today's episode.
definitely. Yeah, pretty tight episode. And yeah, of course, if, guess just our usual housekeeping stuff here. Of course, if you like this episode, please be sure to like and to comment to comment on it or to subscribe to our podcast. Of course, leave us a rating on any of your podcasting platforms of choice: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify. If you have any questions, of course, please do reach out to us if you want to, continue the conversation. We are ostrichtechnique@gmail.com. And yeah, I mean, from Chris and myself, thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys on the next episode, which will be the Avengers. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.
Thanks.